participation.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Summer service. Thanks, Dan and Kent. I'm Karen Dorn-Steele, today's lay leader, and I welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spokane with greetings to our other viewers from around the United States and Canada. Today's guest speaker, the Reverend Moro, is also appearing online from Portland, Oregon. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago and Star King School for the Ministry. He's lived and studied in India, Singapore, Thailand, the Netherlands, and Japan, and has also served churches in California, Illinois, and the Pacific Northwest. He's a founding member of the Tri-Cities Interfaith Alliance in our state and has recently been named Minister Emeritus after serving Portland's Y East UU congregation for 6 years. So let's welcome Reverend Moro. Whether you're in our sanctuary or participating from afar, it's here that we join to create a nourishing religious home with a mission to champion justice, diversity, and environmental stewardship in the wider world, or as we say more briefly, to create community, find meaning, and work for justice. Now, please take a few minutes to greet one another.
camper and truck and trailer with the 2 dogs.
Awesome. It's nice to meet you.
It's good to meet you.
Yeah.
We now turn from our informal greetings to formally begin our service by lighting our chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, of our unity and solidarity, of our openness and inclusion, of our community and individuality. May this small flame be our offering of warmth to those who are cold and alone, and a light to those in darkness. May it be a flame that ignites justice in our world and a beacon of hope to those in need. And may it reflect at least a spark of truth wherever truth has been lost, and cast a healthy shadow of doubt where it has been found. When I left the Presbyterian church of my childhood to join this church in the 1970s, I read a book by Dr. George Marshall, Challenge of a Liberal Faith. Maybe some of you have read it as well. Donna is nodding. It was first published in 1966, 5 years after the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists that Marshall helped achieve. He was a friend of Dr. Albert Schweitzer. He marched for civil rights in Selma, and he led the Church of the Larger Fellowship for 25 years. In his book, Marshall asked the question, is Unitarianism a new religion? Yes and no, he wrote. It is new in the sense that it is discovered anew by each adherent, and constantly redefined and recreated in the light of our new experiences and increased wisdom. However, it is also a religion that is as old as the first protest against conformity and the unthinking acceptance of other religions. In a broad sense, Akhenaten, the Egyptian pharaoh who first perceived an ethical monotheism, may have been a Unitarian Universalist. As were Confucius, most of the Greek dramatists and philosophers, the Hebrew prophets who protested the decadence of the religion of their day, and Jesus, who was a minority of one in his time. For Socrates, it means the hemlock, for Jesus, the cross, for Servetus, the fire, and for many others, it has meant personal abuse and cries of heresy or infidel. Reverend Moro will go far back in UU history today to the 16th century world of Transylvania, where a world of religious liberals made a pledge not to persecute each other because of differences of opinion on religious questions. Thus, wrote Marshall, they were united together, hence Unitarian.
Please stand as you're willing and able and join me for 1007 in this book here. There's a river flowing in my soul, and this is a song for the moany, the gut, the low, so you can hum as Mara starts the song. There's a river flowing in my soul.
Telling me that I'm sorry.
Each time we gather as a congregation, there are always those who are with us in our hearts and minds and whom we want to wrap in our love and care. We light a candle this morning for them. We also mourn the suffering of the Ukrainian people in Russia's war, including Russia's efforts to withhold grain supplies from hungry people worldwide, plus the undermining of democracy in Israel while Palestinians await justice. Let us share a moment in silence, embracing others who are here in our hearts. You're welcome to say their names, those named aloud and those remembered in the silence we hold in our community of compassion. We now gratefully give and receive this morning's offering, which sustains this community and its mission to the larger world.
Thank you for such a beautiful song. Today's story for all ages is something I've adapted from Erica Hewitt. Raise your hand if you've been to a baseball game. Okay, yeah, it's the all-American sport, right? How many of you follow a team that you think is your team? All right, love to hear from the kid here. Max, who's your team? Spokane Indians, all right. Well, I have bad news. I've just received an advance copy of a statement that will be released tomorrow. It's very surprising. You won't believe what it says. Hear ye, all citizens of Washington State, effective immediately, are hereby notified that baseball is now illegal within our borders. From today onward, it is absolutely forbidden to watch baseball, play baseball, or go to a baseball game. You can't even stand in your backyard with a ball and bat. If you must, buy a frisbee or kick around a soccer ball. Don't ask why. We have reasons, and we mean it. No matter how old you are or which team you used to root for, you will be in huge trouble if you watch or play baseball in the state of Washington starting today. Baseball is going to be illegal? What are we going to do? Let's pretend. What would you do if you could go to jail for playing baseball or watching it? What would you do? Go to jail. All right, she says, I'll just go. What are our other options? Picket. Protest. Yes. Any other ideas? Max? Say it again. Okay, they don't play baseball in Washington. So all of those are possible ways to respond. Maybe this law doesn't affect you all because you don't like baseball and you just shrug it off. Maybe the threat of prison scares you enough to stop or sneak around. Maybe you cross the border to Idaho every time you want to hit a few balls or watch a team play. This may sound like a funny example to talk about, but there are countries where doing everyday, simple things are forbidden. A lot of time, these forbidden things have to do with speaking your mind or practicing your religion. Imagine that you woke up tomorrow and found out that it was against the law not to play baseball, but to be a Unitarian Universalist or to talk about Unitarian Universalist beliefs. That's the situation that some of our ancestors faced. Nearly 500 years ago in Europe, people got tired of being told that there was only one way to practice religion. They began to read the Bible themselves, and they thought about it, which meant that they started coming up with new ideas. A few of them were Unitarians. These brave people began to practice being Unitarians even though it was forbidden. They could get in a lot of trouble, and they did. Some of them said, "Fine, I'll stop. It's not that important to me. I'll go along with what I'm supposed to believe." Some of them said, "I'll be a Unitarian in secret with the people I trust, but in public I'll pretend to go along with the crowd." Some of them said, "I'm out of here," and they left the places where it was most dangerous to be a Unitarian and tried to find countries where it was safer. And a few of them said, "Nope, I'm going to be a Unitarian anyway and talk about my beliefs, even if it gets me into trouble, because I can't deny my conscience and my faith." The truth is, we needed all of those early Unitarians. You'll be happy to know that it is totally safe and legal to play and watch baseball in Washington. But I hope you're also happy to be a UU. Let's be grateful to the people throughout the past 500 years who made sure that we could inherit this faith, and let's take care of it for the future generations. And now join me in singing our child to Play Club.
As we prepare for meditation, I invite you to relax, center yourself, and reflect on these words by UU Minister John Brigham. "Go your ways, knowing not the answers to all things, yet always seeking the answer to one more thing than you know. And now the Reverend Craig Moro has a reading for us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that lovely children's story. I think a good religious service integrates everybody and everything in it. It all is part of this very, very a nice party to be at that we all can enjoy. I also want to invite you, speaking of 500 years ago, there was some divergence among the Unitarians 500 years ago about some important questions, including what day you should have your religious services and what you should eat and some things like that. So at my next talk in August, we'll talk a little bit about how they handled those differences of opinion. Well, I don't do many New Testament-based readings for UU churches because that book comes loaded with so many issues for us. It's the scripture of the majority religion in our country, and within that majority, there's a vocal minority who would like to make it everyone's religion, if not by outright law, then by hook or by crook. Conversion of others seems important to many of these folks, much more important than practicing this religion themselves. That's an interesting thing. For some people, they're not happy till they hear you saying, I believe. That's more important than doing what they believe. Well, these folks actively try to hook as many as they can, taking Jesus' words about making his disciples fishers of men quite literally, I guess. The crook part comes when they try to hijack public spaces with things like 10 Commandments monuments or public schools, hijacking public schools with creationism or intelligent design in biology classes, replacing reason, experiment, and careful testing of ideas with doctrines that someone feels to be true. After too much hook and crook, we may hesitate to explore the riches of the book. This is a shame, because its riches are many. The story it tells is sad and strong, sorrowful and stirring, filled not with facts or divine secrets, but with a human truth, powerfully told, like we find in this scene. Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go yonder and pray." And taking with him Peter and two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." He wants out, if possible, from a situation that's closing in on him, backed by the power of civil and religious authority. He's glad that at least he still has friends to watch his back until he looks back and finds they're all asleep. He shakes them, goes to pray once more, returns, and again they're sawing logs. Then it happens a third time. And now he says, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of his main disciples, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs sent by the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, the one I shall kiss is the man, seize him. And he came up to Jesus at once and said, Hail, Master! And he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, why are you here? Here's a kiss and a question that's worth spending some more time with. After we pause for a moment to hear this music. Thanks so much. It's great to see two friends working together. They're, for those who weren't there for the first service, they played it a little bit different this time. You know, that's the kind of thing that friends do. They play off of each other. They have a rhythm, develop a rhythm and an interactive style. But Jesus, this is the only time I ever heard him that I can recall addressing somebody as friend. Hail, Master, friend, why are you here? In the Gospel of Matthew, these words and that kiss from Judas are the very last contact that Jesus will have with any of his disciples before his death. Contact with Judas, not Peter or one of the other nice ones, the ones with the good reputations. Judas. Well, the story continues. Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so?" We might wonder if this last bit was added to show that Jesus is ultimately in control of the whole situation. It's written in the scriptures. These events have been predicted after all. But I felt in his earlier words, "Friend, why are you here?" A note of real surprise, even shock. Maybe there's a tragicomic edge in his voice now as the reality sets in, yet he boasts that he could call for a dozen legions of angels, or even more. If they're legionnaires, would they be dressed like Roman soldiers, these angels, with helmets and shields and the whole bit? Well, maybe Jesus is mocking Judas with this graphic image of God sending in his band of armed supporters. "Hey, look," he says, "speaking of bands, mine is bigger than yours." Maybe Judas was his joking buddy among the disciples, unlike Peter, who was always just too earnest and who was about to run away along with all the rest. Judas is the only one to stay. He's still there. And Jesus gives it to him in front of everyone, just like Judas had given Jesus that kiss. It's the first Judas kiss we can call by that name, but hardly the last. Francis, David, and Giorgio Biandrata were also good friends back in the 1500s in Transylvania, where the first Unitarian churches to use that name were soon to be established. Francis David, or David Ferenc, in Hungarian usage, was the intellectually gifted son of a shoemaker. He first attended Catholic seminary and became rector of a Catholic school. He then embraced the Reformation and went on to become superintendent of all Hungarian Lutheran churches. Later, after further study and revision of his views, he became superintendent of all the rival Calvinist Reformed churches. He eventually became the very first Unitarian minister in the world and bishop of all the Unitarian churches that had formed during this final stage of his career. He also died as the first truly Unitarian martyr. Who knows how much of this would have happened if not for his friendship with Biandrata. Biandrata had come from Italy, studied medicine in France, then made his way across Europe as the personal physician to a number of noble families, specializing in what were called the nervous disorders of women. He was also fascinated by religious questions and had spent time in Geneva, where John Calvin had established himself as something like the Ayatollah of a Protestant theocratic state. Calvin mistrusted his probing, inquisitive mind and wrote of him as a, quote, treacherous troublemaker, a barbarian, a beast, and a dirty dog. Like it is so often with Calvin, you can just feel the Christian love pouring out of him. Oops, here we go. It seems like I got muted there for a second. And thereby gained influence in the court of King John Sigismund. Getting to know Francis David as a Reformed church leader, he helped set him up as the king's court preacher. Eventually, under the influence of these men, Sigismund would become the first, last, and only Unitarian king in history. But that's a story for another day. Biandrata had cultivated relationships with many leaders of the Reformation, but he developed a special closeness with David. Together they began to probe Orthodox Christian doctrines ever deeper. taking their inquiries beyond anything Luther or Calvin had ever attempted or would have allowed. Biandrata was always pushing David to go still further, back in those early days. Europe at the time had been going through a communications revolution not unlike the one we've been experiencing these past years. Before the widespread use of paper and the invention of the printing press, books had been few and rare and extremely expensive. A whole herd of sheep was required to provide the vellum for a hand-lettered Bible, copied by a herd of scribes. And this was reflected in the cost. The sharp rise in the availability of books and the spread of literacy once the printing press came along went hand in hand with earth-shaking results, especially in people's religious lives. With their own Bibles in hand, more and more people could question the teachings of the church, come to their own conclusions, and write their own books to share with others. When church or civil authorities objected to a book, they might attempt to seize and destroy all copies, but this became increasingly difficult with the books in decreasing size. A folio might be bigger than a desktop computer, but the quarto was much smaller. The octavo, duodecimo, and sextodecimo texts were smaller still, corresponding to the laptop, iPad, and smartphones of the time. How could you find and destroy all of them? Little ones could fit in your pocket. You could find and destroy a printing press, true, or you could try to destroy the author. People watched this unfolding drama of ideas, transformation, and power with great fascination. One historian of the time wrote that public debates of important questions were as popular as tournaments and jousts had formerly been, and no subjects had a more lively appeal than those of religion. Such debates could as easily end in death as those earlier forms of entertainment, which may have added to their appeal. Torture and prison were also likely outcomes for those who lost or offended the wrong people while winning. It wasn't false and true knowledge of God. It was devoted mostly to serious and sober arguments of scriptural versus ecclesiastical or church teachings about the nature of the divine. But it also included one chapter illustrated with graphic representations of the Trinity that was still affirmed on both sides of the Catholic-Protestant divide. These included pictures of a three-faced figure installed on an altar, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit sitting at a table, or Father, Son, and Holy Spirit being transformed into a communion wafer. And there was even a depiction of the actual flesh of Christ descending from heaven, I guess kind of like a meat suit. It's important to note, though, that David and Biandrata had created none of these images themselves. They were all from perfectly orthodox sources, such as church sculptures or tapestries from different parts of Europe. The new medium of printing had made it possible to bring all of them together in the critical text. As is so often the case, though, the graphics got the most attention from offended Orthodox believers who felt that their noses were being rubbed in something that they themselves had produced. We say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. But we should add that it also speaks those words again and again at every glance, and the sight can burn into the soul until its sound is overwhelming. That's no fun to experience, although I think that the two friends had fun with the book. And you believe those guys believe in this? Please understand that Biandrata and David were not doing this just for the pleasure of argument, or simply to be contrarians. They acted out of concern for salvation and fear that such religious beliefs as God existing in three persons put every unsuspecting believer in danger of punishment for the sin of idolatry or polytheism. But still, I do think that they had fun doing what they did. It can be very exciting for friends to face some danger together, especially if they feel they've got a king in their corner. David and Biandrata weathered the storm over the book and its graphics. At Biandrata's urging, David entered and won several important theological debates, including one at the city of Arad, where, true to his name David, he bested several well-known Goliaths in religious matters. He then boldly proclaimed, Egy az Isten, God is one, standing on a boulder in the city of Kolozsvár. And then he was carried on the shoulders of a cheering crowd to his church. Many churches throughout the city and the region were soon openly Unitarian in theology. Egy az Isten was written over many doors and pulpits, proclaiming a new freedom of inquiry and full liberty to study and interpret the scriptures according to one's own reason and conscience. But 2 years later, King John Sigismund was dead. Transylvania had a new prince, and things changed in the circles of power. Through his role as a physician, Biandrata smoothly insinuated himself into the new ruler's good graces. Meanwhile, David, denied a place at court and now without access to a printing press, began to ask ever more challenging questions, such as whether Christ, since he was not called God by the apostles, could positively be called God. And if not, whether he could be invoked in prayers. Could we ask Jesus to help us or save us? Does Jesus save, like highway signs still say today? No, said David. We must ask God alone for help, just as Jesus did in that lonely garden before his arrest. Remember that? He's praying to God, saying, your will, not mine. Not as if they were one person. Along with many others, Biandrata thought that David was going too far and urged him to recant. He was worried that such extreme views could put all Unitarian churches, their ministers and members at risk. It was a legitimate concern, though no doubt he was also worried about the well-being and livelihood of one Giorgio Biandrata, who had grown accustomed to the pleasures of high society and now felt exposed and vulnerable. David responded by going even further and proclaimed that Jesus should not be worshipped as God. He would not use the language that certain colleagues insisted he should use. So Biandrata denounced him to the prince, who had David put under house arrest, and forbade him to speak in church. He was silenced. Who would have ever thought that we would see such demands to toe the same language line in Unitarian Universalist churches today, under threat of punishments like censure, excommunication, and professional death? Or that we'd see a group of ministers, again in air quotes, attack a colleague for writing a book that calls for reasonable discourse. Of course, that's exactly what we've been seeing and how certain colleagues of mine, some of whom you might know, have been treated these past few years. I myself was banned from one church where I'd been a frequent guest for over 20 years for supporting my colleagues. But like these courageous souls today, Francis David was unbowed. Before beginning his confinement, he preached one final sermon which ended like this: whatever the world may yet try to do, it will nevertheless become clear to the whole world that God is one. Egy az Isten. Shortly thereafter, at Biandrata's urging, the prince had a council convened to put David on trial. Social class played a role here. The shoemaker's son was to be judged by a panel of hereditary nobles whose interests were vested more in hierarchy and power than in truth or conscience. Biandrata took the role of chief prosecutor and attacked David on the grounds that by teaching us to worship God alone, he was essentially preaching a conversion to Judaism. He could also have said Islam, but might have felt nervous about doing so with the great Ottoman Empire looming right next door. David replied by asking if Biandrata had not also held such views until recently. His friend replied that even if he once had, he no longer did so. Long arguments and testimony followed. David and his supporters were asked to leave the hall for a time while the panel deliberated. While they were out, Biandrata denied that he had ever shared David's views, which he called no less than blasphemy. When David was called back inside, Biandrata crossed the floor to, quote, embrace him and reassure him that all would be well. It's not recorded if he kissed his old partner or not, but how could anyone present have failed to see Judas and Jesus in these two? One of Biandrata's fellow prosecutors argued for the death penalty, while others pleaded for David's life. At any rate, the guilty verdict had been reached by the time of the former friend's embrace. It was a done deal. David, who was already ill, was sentenced to life imprisonment in a castle dungeon where he died 5 months later. His burial place was kept a secret. That's a time-honored way to keep such graves from becoming rallying points or shrines for dissenters. What about Giorgio Biandrata? He soon cut off relations with his former Unitarian colleagues, began to associate more with Catholic patrons, but most often kept to himself. Religious matters no longer seemed to hold his interest, and he turned his efforts to amassing as much money as possible. Eventually, he named one of his nephews as the heir to his large fortune, on the surprising condition that the young man must remain Unitarian for life. Some say that this nephew smothered the good doctor in his sleep in order to claim his inheritance early. The evidence is mixed. It seems that, on one hand, Biandrata had abandoned his friend for safety, comfort, and wealth. But it seems there was also a part of him that stayed where he and his friend had done so much together. That must have been a terrible tension for him to bear. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that Judas returned the 30 pieces of silver he got for betraying Jesus, and then he hanged himself. The book of Acts says that he used the money to buy himself some land, but when he stepped onto the land, he sort of exploded with the blast centered in his bowels. Not a happy ending. Not a happy story. And I'm not sure that I'd like to see this bit depicted graphically. Speaking of graphics, here's one that you should see. Can we show that graphic now on screen? There we go. You know what that is? That shows the symbol of the Unitarian churches of Transylvania to this day, inspired by a line from the Gospel of Matthew that's supposed to have been one of Francis David's favorites. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Notice how the serpent seems to hold the dove within limits, but also notice how it's swallowing its own tail. That can make your bowels explode big time if you go too far. But even before that happens, the more the serpent swallows its own wisdom, the less it will shelter, and the more it will smother the dove. And we can close the graphic now. It's a powerful graphic, especially if you know that the next gospel line tells us to beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils. I don't know if the church adopted this symbol before or after the events I've shared with you today. What's your guess? Before or after? It's a difficult thing to try to imagine. But friends, why are you here? If not to think about such difficult things sometimes. It's a difficult story, sorrowful and stirring, but it's our story too. And knowing it will only make us stronger. May we go forward into light, knowing our roots grow strong in what is sometimes some real darkness. Blessed be. Thank you for having me today.
Please stand for number 326 in the gray hymnal. Moro's going to play through it once. First. Let all the beauty we have known illuminate our hearts and minds. Rejoice in wonders daily shown, in faith and joy and love that binds. Let all celebrate with singing hearts the loveliness of sky and earth, the inspiration of the arts, the miracle of every birth. Life's music and its poetry surround and bless us through our days. For these we sing in harmony, together giving thanks and praise.
As we depart today, I leave you with the words of Dr. Albert Schweitzer from his autobiography, Out of My Life and Thought. I therefore stand and work in the world as one who aims at making men less shallow and morally better by making them think. Amen. Blessed be. Salam alaikum and shalom.